Are you making requests like this, or this, or even like this? If you want to handle REST APIs properly and professionally, stay until the end of this video and you will stop being ashamed of your code. Hello and welcome to another tutorial, this time on the Fetch API in TypeScript or JavaScript. Most developers use the Fetch API to make requests to some REST APIs. Fetch is native to TypeScript and JavaScript nowadays, and it is totally fine to use it. The problem is how you use it and structure your code. Of course, you can also use other ways to make requests, such as using the Axios library. Today, I will use the Fetch API to make my point and show you why you are making requests in the wrong way. You can then apply the structure and thinking to your approach, of course. If you look closely at these examples of using Fetch, we are always giving it the endpoint or URL to call. Okay, right here, then right here, and also setting that right here. The biggest problem with this is we are giving it manually and hard-coded as a string in the code base. Now imagine you just sold your application to another client. On the new client environment, the API will be deployed on the new host, port, and even on a completely different path. Then what you need to do? Yes, you got it. You need to look for all the files where the fetch is being called and change the code again and again and again. Can you imagine doing this for 10, 50 or even 100 different clients? Let's see how can we solve the problem and have a dynamic solution that fits every client. We need to structure the code so the Fetch API receives the complete URL dynamically from a configuration file. To do so, we just need to change a centralized file with all the configurations as the host, port, whether the API is secure or not, and so on. After that, we will create an abstraction to build the endpoint based on the configuration file and also to handle the Fetch API in some directions you want to define. After that, we create a service abstraction grouped by entity where we call the Fetch API abstraction we just did and expose simple functions we can call to get the data. Moreover, we will have type safety on all of these using TypeScript generic types, and let's dive into the code and fully understand it. First, we need to create the configuration file, the config.json, on your application. In my case, it's inside app source and config.json. And here, what we have the configuration for the host, in this case is localhost, if it is secure or not, so we will use HTTP or HTTPS, and then the port to connect, and the base and common path or context to our API. If we need to use credentials on the fetch call, if you want to send the cookies, and also we need to specify the endpoint. What are these? Basically, you specify a key, an unique identifier that you can then grab using the code that maps to the route on your API. Imagine you want to go to the localhost 8080 API v1 my database API and then /users/all. You will get this endpoint property. We will understand it in a bit. What is the next step? Now we create our service utils. I have here my service utilities that is inside the utils folder. And here we define the fetch data function that handles the Fetch API call based on our settings. Firstly, what we need to load our file, our config.json. I'm setting here some base constants to use throughout the project and also defining here what are the allowed methods to use, in this case get, post, delete, put and patch. You can decide what you want. And then one of the core things of this logic. Firstly, we need to specify the success response that handles the case, or it will type the case of when our REST API returned successfully some data. In this case, we are putting here that the code is a success and we are giving the typing to the data property of this object as a generic type. It's D for data. In the case of getting an error from the API, we are defining here a generic type with error as default, and the code will be error, and we also type here the error. Then we build our base fetch response that can receive a generic type to type the data and a generic type to type the error. But remember, we give it a default value, so you can omit this generic when using it. And basically our base fetch response, it's a promise that can return the success response using the data, okay, from here, or the error response type using the error from here. We will get a response that is a promise that can be a successful response or an error response. Then we have the build endpoint function that receives an endpoint property from the config endpoints. That can be these ones you can see on the hover, that we have the configuration here, and this is where we map the configuration file into the final URL. Basically, here we get the configuration file we are loading, and we are building the URL by looking and see if it is secure. Yes, then use HTTPS. If not, the string will have HTTP. Then we set the host, the port, / the API base path context, and we are grabbing from the configuration endpoint the value for a given endpoint property we are receiving. So imagine I called that function with get users, I will grab this value. If I call that function with get book by ID, I will grab this value and put that in the string. This is how you can generate the URL. And then our fetch data function that abstracts the use of the fetch API function. Basically, it's an asynchronous function, of course, and it will return the base fetch response with the D and the E that we basically put there and use a default as error. For you to be able to have here the generics, you need to pass it when using the function. We will see that later. We receive the endpoint property to use on the build endpoint function here. So we build URL here using the build endpoint function and giving it the endpoint property. We get the method, by default is get, and it can be only one of these. We also can have the body data if it is a post, of course, that will be an object with keys as string and some unknown values. The type is unknown. And we also have the query string parameters that we can use on get, that is an object of strings, because the parameters on URL must be a string. I got this to do because for this tutorial I don't have the bare tokens authentication implemented, of course, but you can do it. Basically, what this function does is we build a common fetch options object from the request init type, that is the type required to use it on the fetch API. If you hover the fetch API, you can see that the options are the request init type. You give it the default headers that you need and also give it the method that we receive on the parameters as an argument. Then if it is a post, we create the body property of these fetch options and we stringify the body data from here. If it is a get or a delete, we use the URL search params to build our query strings. If in the configuration file you have the use credentials as true, it means that we want the credentials property set as include in the fetch options, in the case you want to do some authentication with cookies, for example. And after building all of that, we really call the fetch API. We have the response, we pass it the API URL that is built based on the build endpoint property that is dynamic based on the config JSON, and also can receive more information with query params if it is a get or a delete. After that, we give it the fetch options that has the headers, the method, the body, if it is a post, and so on. If the response is okay, we will try to get the response as a JSON. And here we type it as D because we receive the data type that is a generic, and you are saying here, okay, when parsing it, this is the type that I will receive. If we do not fail on this process to parse it to JSON, then we return the success and the data typed as the D type we send on the function call. If for some reason we failed on this step, we throw an error that we catch right away and return the error as he. We firstly try to fetch. If it is not okay, we return the error. If it is okay, then we go and try to parse it to JSON. If there's an error, we throw an error so we can enter in the outside try catch statement and return the error. If for some reason we do not do anything here, we return by default the error cannot make the service request, as the error we receive here as the generic type. That being said, how we use this fetch data and how we should use it. What I like to do to have an abstraction and avoid handling some changes on a lot of files, I always create a services folder that you can then segregate that inside the specific models or modules or even inside specific entities. But let's use it globally. You have service folders and then imagine an API that returns users and another one that returns books. I will have two files, and inside each one is where I use the fetch data to create an abstraction. And let's see that. Inside the user services, I import the fetch data. Okay, I set the type for a user with an ID, a name, an age, and a join date, and I have here two functions. The first one will return all users. And what you need to do, basically, we need to call the fetch data. I'm specifying here the D. Okay, let me try to split the screen. So it will receive a D and E as generic types. Don't forget the E is receiving as default error type. Okay, I do not need to send the error type if I don't want, because it will assume the default value. I call the fetch data. I'm saying, okay, I will receive an array of users, and also the endpoint property will be the get users. If I delete this and I do control space, I have the list of all the possibilities because we are typing it as key of type of config endpoints. Why I'm not sending anything else? Because the method is get by default and I don't want to send some body data or query string parameters, okay? Then I just can use this function that will return the response from it. And why I'm building this and not just calling this directly? Because imagine that you need to call this API in 5 or 6 different files. If for some reason this endpoint property changes, you need to update in 5 or 6 files. But if you use this abstraction, you have a function here and you just need to change the endpoint property here and nowhere else. And you can use the get all users everywhere on the code and it will be working as a charm. The same here for the get user by ID. I will get only a user, not an array of users, so I will pass it here. I will use the get user by ID, that is get user by ID, so I will build the URL using users/users/. I will say that is a get, and why I'm specifying it here, because I want to send a query string with parameters to filter. I need to send the get, if I can show it, so method is get, the body data will be undefined, and we have the query string parameters here that will receive an object with an ID and user ID converted to string. Then inside we are checking if you have parameters, and if so we create a URL/parameters and put that on the URL to call. I have the same example for the books, where you get the books or the books by ID is the same logic. So you have an abstraction here to call your endpoints, and you have only a simple function without parameters, or you can send it parameters so you can also give it to the fetch API. Finally, to see all of that working, I have this doing stuff file that basically imports the service abstractions that we did, the get all users, get user by ID, and the same ones for the books. We also import the success response code and error response code from the service utilities with a find there. I have here a function as an example where You call, for instance, the getAllBooks and you have a response. And as you can see, the response is typed as error response or success response with a book array. But if you try here to do something like book response dot something, TypeScript only allows you to access to the code. If you can see here on the type definition, it can be success or error response, and the only thing that they have in common is code. By using this approach, we are limiting the amount of problems that you can have with the API. How that is done? Basically, you always need to check the type of code, if it is success or error, and when you check if it is success, you are doing type narrowing, and the TypeScript compiler will know that inside this scope, inside the if statement, the book's response data exists because you type it there. If the code is success, then you have data. If the code is error, then you have the error property. It's basically it. Inside of this, you can have the books response, and when you put the dot, it will automatically recognize that you still have the code, of course, and the data property, because it is a success response. On the other hand, of course, if you go to the books response dot, we'll have the code or the error. And that's how you force your teammates to make good code and to handle all the things correctly. You can do that for every endpoint that you need to call. This example, you are sending some parameters and then you check, okay, if it is a successful response, we grab the data. If it is not, we grab the message. Let me just put the API running. It's an Express API that I have with those endpoints we have here on the config file, just to show you the example. And this is some random responses, because inside the API I'm building some random objects with random names and values. And you can see that you have the response here. You called the fetch API. I can quickly show the API code index file, and basically I have users whole endpoint turning some stuff and the users and the books. Basically, you have the ability here to make sure you always process if the fetch API had a successful response or not. You also can get the typing inferred on the .data property, because when you go to the books response .data, you can see that it's a book array, okay? If you hover it, it's a book array. And why it can infer it is because you receive in the fetch data, and we are saying here, okay, the data will be from the D generic type. When you, for instance, here in the user services, when you use the fetch data, we are typing the data that will be sent from the API when you have a successful response, of course. So you know that is a book array. If you go to the first one, you can go and grab the author ID, publish date and title, and you have IntelliSense, and it's everything there. It will be easier to use. Now you say, that's nice, very neat, very, very nice, but what if I need to call multiple APIs? And I also have the solution for that. Let's see the examples on the multi-connection folders and files that I have here. Let me undo the changes. Let me open all the files. I have some files inside the multiple connections. Basically, it's the same logic, but multiple connections, okay? So let me open it and doing stuff, and also the config multiple. What's the difference here? You can have different API ports configured. Imagine now two different APIs. You can modify the code and use it to connect to the APIs you need, of course. In this example, it's just two. Imagine that the host will be the same. You can also put here database API host or service API host if they are different. You just need to put more properties inside the config file. You can also segregate the endpoints even more. You can also do something like, for the user, I have this endpoint inside. You can then do all of that stuff. The thing is that you need to add one more property so you can navigate to endpoint, then the module or the entity name, and then the endpoint value. So let's put that in the default way. You have all the settings here. Let me put that on the right side so you can have that as an example. In the service utilities, it's very similar. What changes? The build endpoint now will have a base function that receives, if it is secure, the host, the port, and the API context, because this is a core functionality and I don't want to repeat myself. So I turn it into a function. And then you have the build endpoint function that is related to the database API only, and the build endpoint services API that will be related to the service API endpoint. Those are random names. You can find the ones that are suitable for your case. In the database API, I call the build endpoint, that is one that is returning if it is secure or not, the host, the database API port, and then I send it the database API path context, while in this function I send it the service API base path context. So I can build it dynamically but with different base contexts on the URL. Then we give it the endpoints property. Here, if you did the segregation by entity, like the one I told you, to put an user here and then the endpoint, you need to receive a parameter that is the entity, and you put here the entity and then you navigate to the property. Let's keep it simple. We know how to build our base URL. Then we have the fetch data. It's the same one, but this time we receive the build endpoint callback, that is basically the function that we want to run. Why you send it there? Because then we will use it here with the endpoint property, and we will have two different and dedicated fetch data functions, one for the database API and another for the service API. The first one calls the fetch data, give it the typings, and uses the database API build endpoint function that will use the database API port and so on, and the other one will use the build endpoint service API function that will use all the service API port, service API base context, and all the related configuration for the service API. And then you just need to do the same. Basically, we'll have the service abstraction in the user services. I will have the fetch database API and we'll give it the type. It will be an array of users. We'll use this get users path, and the same for the get user by ID that will return this time only a user. Okay. I have also a random services because it's just this one, so I can show you two different APIs being called, and here I call the fetch service API data and not the database API with the random path, and the random path will return a random type that inside has an ID and a title that also are completely random. Then you just need to import all of that from the new multi-connections files, and you do the same. You call the function, then you'll have a response, and you need to check if it is success or not. Then you have typing on your data property, and you can access here to age ID join data name, because you know this is a user, and the user type you have here as those properties, right? In the index, I will call the example for multiple services, and let's clear this and run this again, and I have the random object response here with some information and all of the other services that I'm calling here. Let me close this. So I'm calling the etal users, the get user by ID, in the random. I have three services, two from one API and another one from another API. I hope you saw how it will make you do better code, more reliable code. It will also give you more structure, more flexibility, and will allow you to use the config.json file even if it is a simple one, a more complex one, or even more complex than this one. It will give you the ability to change and tweak all the settings, and in a matter of minutes you have your application running in a different environment to another client without changing all the URLs and configurations throughout your code base. Okay, thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you now are a master on the Fetch API. Of course, you can use another library and use all of this abstraction and all of these typing and functions around of it, like the Axios library. You just need to understand the approach and tweak it to adapt to your situation. See you in the next tutorial. Bye bye.